Hey guys, this is Colin Moshman for CardShot.com, and we are continuing on right now with me and Katie's course, Become a Winning Poker Player in 30 Days with Day 18, Hand Reading. So we call this one Secrets of the Poker Magicians. And like we said in the text, you'll often see some kind of really impressive soul read where TV Pro calls out an opponent's hand. And while that is without doubt an amazing feat, this is mainly going to be the process of hand reading and becoming a great hand reader, and we're going to talk about how to do that today. So definition of hand reading is simple: to put your opponent on as accurate a hand range as possible. Like we'll see a lot of the time, that's going to be tough to be super precise, but all we can do is the best we have with the information that we're provided in the hand from our opponent's betting patterns and anything else. So we're going to ask ourselves important questions. Like let's say, for example, that we've got a really strong hand at the river, but our opponent jams on us representing the nuts. We say, okay, well, what better hands are consistent with his actions? If he really does have the nuts, would he play the hand this way pre-flop or at the flop and at the turn? So we reconstruct what's gone on and see if it's a consistent story. Another common question, so let's say that we're considering bluff catching at the turn or the river. If he had a bust or draw, would he play it this way at the flop? So let's say he's been betting. Is he an aggressive player who tends to semi-bluff his draws? So those are a couple of important questions that we'll be asking ourselves. And the general process we want to go through is we want to go through his full betting pattern for the hand, starting with pre-flop. And pre-flop is so important because if you have an opponent who isn't a total maniac, and it's super rare that you're going to have an opponent who's literally on any two cards in any position pre-flop. People talk about that and they'll be like, okay, well, you know what, I'm up against this guy and he can have any two cards, but it's actually really rare. Usually you're going to have people who have some standards. They're not going to have a 100% VPIP. In other words, when somebody has raised and re-raised before them, they're not going to put money into the pot with just any old hand. And this is most extreme if you have, say, a tight aggressive player who's raised under the gun, but pre-flop is always going to give us a lot of information. And when we get to today's hand examples, we're going to see exactly how that comes into play. And the other thing is overall tendencies. So anything that we know about our opponent. Let's say, for example, that he's a passive player and he's putting out a big bet on a late straight. That says a lot. That is probably going to override any other information we have. The fact that he's timid but wants to put a lot of money into the pot when it's the turn or the river. So that's going to be a very important piece of information to use in solving the puzzle of hand reading. And here's one bonus tip, okay? If somebody makes a very fast call, that's usually going to be some kind of draw or non-nut hand, okay? In other words, some kind of hand like bottom or second pair, a mediocre top pair hand. Again, draws are going to be very common. And the reason why this is because if somebody has a very strong hand, they're usually at least going to consider raising. Or they're going to take a little bit of time to enjoy it or to pretend to you that they might not have a hand that's so strong that they're never going to consider folding. So timing tells can be useful, and this to me is one of the ones that I have found the most useful throughout my poker career on very fast calls. Now, a couple of very important points to remember before we go on to today's hands. One of them, so when I say you're not trying to read robots, bots could play unpredictably, but they're probably going to have some logic behind what they're doing. Whereas humans can do incredibly unpredictable things. Okay, a human can make a play because he's drunk or upset or happy or has money to burn or because the stove is beeping because his pizza's ready and his wife is yelling at him. Who knows what's going on in somebody's mind? So some of the time you're just going to be completely surprised because somebody makes a play that goes against logic or against what they would normally do. And I guarantee you, if you have someone like, when I think of a great hand reader, I think of Daniel Negreanu, because at least from what you see on TV, he's always calling out his opponent's hands super well. And I guarantee you that if you were doing that over and over, some of the time he would be legitimately surprised. He would get it totally wrong. And that's just part of the process and part of the fun. So never worry if that is the case. With that said, let's go ahead now and look at some examples of putting hand reading into practice. We're going to begin with a hand in an MTT where hero raises under the gun with King 10 suited, which is a fine raise. forced to act 8-handed. We get 3 opponents and have this decent top pair hand. Here he elects to c-bet, which I like with the flush draw being out there, and gets called in 2 places. So right now, we don't necessarily know a ton about our opponent's ranges, but we've got a pretty good idea if they like their hand enough to call on this flop that they're usually going to have either another king, a 6, some of the time a good deuce, like for example a hand like ace deuce, a pocket pair like pocket 7s, maybe pocket 5s with a 5 of diamonds, or a flush draw. So hands like that are going to be very common for these guys to have. So what we're always trying to do is continue to narrow down ranges. So we have this great turn card, we continue to fire. We no longer care about this guy, he's folded. Now we're only interested, we are honed in like eagles on this player in the big blind. He calls, and when he does, we can continue narrowing his range a lot. Now it's much less likely that he has a 6 or any other lower pair because he's called twice, and this is a bad turn card for him. It's a larger bet, so most players, if they have a hand like 7-6 or pocket 5s, are going to fold at this point in the hand. So what's most likely for him is a king or a flush draw. So with that said, we now get our final piece of the puzzle, which is he jams on this ace river. And well, this is not going to be today's quiz question. Just go ahead and think, what do you think makes the most sense for him to have here? So he could be overplaying a hand like King Jack. He might have an occasional slow play with bottom set or something totally random like Ace 8 or just complete air. But the hand that probably makes the most sense is a busted flush draw. There are lots of suited hands he's going to call with pre from the big blind. He's not going to fold a flush draw usually at the flop or the turn. And then at the river, he's got no chance of winning the pot at showdown unless he bluffs and reps the ace. So that's going to be the hand that I think is most consistent with his action on every street. And of course here we just have to call with their 2 pair. But that is in fact correct. So he has had a busted flush draw. He bluffs it. And that is the process of hand reading that we're not always going to get perfectly correct like we do here, but in this instance works out very well. Now let's take a look at pocket kings. So here is going to raise from the low jack and a sit and go. Get called by the small blind. And small blind calling ranges are going to be reasonably wide, but not as wide as big blind calling ranges. So a lot of the time, pre-flop, this guy will be on a range of low-mid pocket pairs, lots of suited aces or decent offsuit aces, Broadway cards, in particular suited Broadway cards. So those are going to be some of the hands we expect to see him have most. Flop is set, so a very coordinated flop, but still pretty happy to get this set. We c-bet, and he calls. And so we could narrow his range down, but why don't we wait until the turn? Because the turn is a street where we really get a lot of information. So he calls the flop, and now he bets out this ace turn. So again, just think for a second. What is your instinct? Okay, what do you put this guy on? Now, there's definitely not just one right answer to that question, but some things are a lot more likely than others at this point in the hand. If he has a flush draw like the Queen of Hearts, he's probably going to check it here. There are some players who will bet out, but that would be more consistent with the check. If he had a king, he's usually going to check. If he had a flush, there's a reasonable chance he would bet out now, but of course there are these 3 high hearts already accounted for. So to me, the hand that this is most consistent with is an ace. Like we said, he's got a lot of aces, ace-x hands that he's going to flat with pre-flop from the small blind. He would then call those hands at the flop, and now with the turn, he's betting for value and protection. So I believe that's going to be the single most frequent hand category we see him have at this point in the hand. Here are raises, which I like. I would raise probably a little bit more. We're going to commit him. We're going to jam any river. And we do that. And in fact, he does have an ace. This is another one that works out very well. And now let's take a look at a slightly more tricky hand reading spot. So here we are playing the heads up endgame of an MTT S&G. Here are raises like we'll talk about in heads up. This would be totally fine to fold as well. This is kind of a light open on the button, but that's a topic for another day. So pre-flop, our opponent's range is super wide. He faces a small raise he could call with a very wide range, so we can't say much at this point, besides the fact that certain hands are less likely, such as complete junk like 5 deuce off, as well as premium hands that he's likely to 3-bet pre-flop. So we connect very well. He check raises, and his check raise range is no longer nearly as wide, but there's also still plenty of things he could be doing this with. He could be doing this with a 4 or a 9. He could have a flush draw, or he could just be on complete air, have absolutely nothing, knowing that we're on a ride range and he's just attacking us. And that kind of thing is much more likely in heads up compared to full ring spots. So we call in order to keep in his bluffs. And his range doesn't change all that much when he continues firing the turn. It's kind of a scare card. He might also be continuing to semi-bluff with his club draws, betting his 4x hands for value. So we continue calling. And the questions we need to ask ourselves here are, what does this river change? What do we put him on at this point in the hand? And should we call, raise, or fold? So we said beforehand that we think he's mainly on a range of 4x hands, 9x hands, flush draws, and total air. So if he had a flush draw that is now the same as air, he's got no showdown value, so that would make sense to bluff. If he has a 4, he can continue to be betting that. And 9 is something that does not make sense anymore. So if he is a 9, is he betting that for value? Is he betting that as a bluff? We would expect him now to switch into check calling mode or maybe check fold facing a large bet, but not just continuing to fire like everything is normal if he did have a 9. So mainly he's going to show us a 4 or some kind of complete air hand. And based on that, it doesn't make all that much sense to raise here unless we're up against a maniac. If he has nothing, then he's just going to fold facing a raise. If he has a 4, then he's got a speed or maybe it's an occasional chop. So for that reason, hero can call here, which he does. And we are actually best. And this is a spot where even though the process was reasonable, hero comes to, or I shouldn't say hero, I come to kind of a wrong conclusion. So what I said here is that this guy's going to show us 4 or busted draw, some kind of total bluff. But in fact, he does have a 9 that just happens to become 2 pair sort of randomly at the turn. And he's continuing to bet for a value with his 2 pair hand. So all you can do is go by the thought process, and here this led us to kind of a wrong conclusion. If we knew we had Queen 9, then obviously we would raise if we're thinking about Queen X hands in his range. But we came up with a range, we acted on that, and that's all you can do. And now we come to today's quiz question. Another MTT spot. I would like to see here put out a 3-bet preflop, what we call, which isn't crazy. The small blind 3 bets. We take a flop. Flop gets checked around. The small blind now bets out. Hijack folds. And here are the 2 questions I have for you guys. Okay, so the first one is, based on what our opponent has done so far in this hand, do we think that his actions are most consistent with which of the following hands? Pocket 10s, Ace 10, Pocket Kings, or 7-6 suited? So that's the first question. And the second part is, what should we do here? Should we fold, call, or raise? So think about that and then give your answer. Okay, so in answering this question, we want to go back to preflop. Preflop is showing a good amount of strength by 3-betting. He's out of position with deep stacks. So this is often going to be a very strong hand, a high pocket pair, a strong ace. Occasionally he'll be doing this light and have a weak hand, but a lot of the time he's got strong hands. Now when he checks the flop, that's really interesting. We're going to get rid of our strongest hands because this is a very coordinated flop. If you have pocket aces, you're going to bet this flop. You're not going to give 2 guys a free card. So that's very unlikely. So pocket queens, pocket kings, pocket aces are all very unlikely at this point. We're also going to make it less likely he has a very weak hand. If he does have a hand like 7-6, he's got no showdown value, he's probably going to bluff that. So we check back. And so what he's doing is very consistent with a hand like pocket 10s. Okay, so pocket 10s would 3-bet preflop a lot of the time and then check the flop because he doesn't want to play a large pot. He's planning to check call. And now bets out at the turn because he thinks his hand is best. So if he had ace 10, he's usually not going to re-raise preflop. If he did, he also might not bet the turn. Pocket kings is super likely to bet the flop. 7-6 is less likely to have re-raised preflop, and if it does, it's probably going to bet the flop with no ability to win at showdown. So the single most hand most consistent hand of the ones we gave here is going to be pocket tens. And what we should do is call. We're getting great odds, but there's not much point in raising here. We're not going to be able to get many worse hands to call us or better hands to fold. So hero correctly calls and checks back the river. Hand is going to be best, but again, it's tough to get too many worse hands to call. It wouldn't be crazy to put out a small bet here for value, but here it does elect to check back, and tens is the hand that our opponent has. So this is another time when hand reading is very effective. So we're going to end this here before picking up on day 19 with small blind play. So hope you guys have enjoyed. This has been Colin Moshman on behalf of myself and Katie Dozier for the cardschat.com course on becoming a winning player in 30 days. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.